The world has seen many televised debates, but few have carried the weight of history like the moment when Ibrahim Traoré sat across from Pastor Rick Warren. The studio lights burned bright, yet the atmosphere was heavier than any set could hold. For those watching live, this was not entertainment. It was a collision of legacies. One rooted in centuries of Western influence, the other carrying the raw urgency of a continent reclaiming its voice. Rick Warren needs little introduction. For decades, his book, The Purpose-Driven Life, has topped charts, translated into scores of languages, and touched millions of believers. He has advised presidents, prayed with kings, and stood in pulpits that echo across nations. His name commands respect in the Christian world, and his calm, reasoned voice has often served as a balm to troubled souls. To have him in dialogue with a political leader from Africa was remarkable in itself. Yet this was no ceremonial meeting of courtesy. It was confrontation clothed in civility. On the other side of the table sat Ibrahim Traoré, the youthful president of Burkina Faso, a land that has often been underestimated on the global stage. Traoré does not wear his authority like armor. He carries it with the conviction of a man who believes history has chosen him. His rise to power was not born of luxury but of resistance, and his reputation as a defender of his people preceded him into the studio. For many Africans, he embodies what an anti-colonial Africa could look like: confident, unyielding, unapologetic. The program began quietly enough. Pastor Warren opened with words of appreciation, commending Traoré for his courage in guiding his nation through uncertain times. He drew parallels to biblical leaders: Moses seeking God's counsel, David facing giants, Solomon asking for wisdom. It was a gentle pastoral framing meant to bless rather than provoke. The audience nodded, some even applauded softly, comforted by the familiar rhythm of Warren's words. Traoré listened attentively. His face was calm, his posture respectful, but his eyes revealed the intensity of a man waiting for the right moment. Then he leaned forward. The cameras caught the subtle shift. Shoulders squared, gaze steady, voice lowering before it rose like fire. "Pastor Rick," he began, "I honor your work and the millions of lives you have touched. But I must tell you, Christianity as it has been packaged and exported to Africa is not the same Christianity that Christ himself lived and died for." The room froze. The audience's applause halted mid-clap. Even Rick Warren, known for his composure, blinked in surprise. For a heartbeat, the silence was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Traoré had not come to echo familiar praises. He had come to speak truths long buried under centuries of polite obedience. He pressed on, voice unwavering. He spoke of how Christianity had reached Africa not as a liberating gospel, but as an accompaniment to colonial conquest. He described a Christ presented not as a brother to the oppressed, but as a distant European figure tied to chains and subjugation. "The Christ we met," he declared, "did not stand with us in our suffering. He was introduced alongside the colonizer, not the fisherman. He was preached in the language of empire, not in the heartbeats of our mothers and fathers." Murmurs began to spread through the audience. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others nodded vigorously, finally hearing aloud what had lingered in silence for generations. Rick Warren tilted his head, readying a reply. But Traoré was not finished. He reminded the studio that Jesus of Nazareth had overturned tables of corruption, walked among fishermen, stood with widows, and embraced the rejected of society. Yet the Christianity imposed on Africa had told people to bow down, to remain silent, to wait patiently for heaven while their land was plundered on earth. At this point, the weight of his words no longer belonged only to the room. The millions watching at home could feel the tremors. Here was a president daring to speak truths not usually voiced in front of Western icons of faith. Rick Warren, ever the seasoned pastor, finally broke the silence. With measured tones, he acknowledged the misuse of Christianity throughout history, admitting that men had often twisted the gospel for personal or political ends. But he insisted that the essence of Christ remained pure, a message of salvation for all, beyond history and oppression. His words were calm, but his eyes betrayed the struggle of a man being confronted by a truth he could not dismiss. The camera shifted again to Traore. A faint smile touched his lips, though his eyes remained piercing. "Yes, Pastor," he responded. "But here's the question. What does salvation mean if a people remain enslaved in their own minds? What does salvation mean if they are told to love their enemies, yet never allowed to love themselves?" The audience erupted in gasps. Some clutched their hands, others burst into spontaneous applause. The tension was no longer confined. It had spilled over, filling the air with the electricity of revelation. And then came the cliffhanger, a moment that would propel the dialogue into global headlines. "But what I must say next," Traore warned, his voice cutting through the uproar, "will not only challenge this studio, it will challenge the very soul of Christianity itself." The silence in the studio was like a drumbeat before a storm. The young leader of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, had already unsettled his audience with the assertion that Christianity in Africa had been more a weapon of conquest than a gospel of freedom. But his next words did more than unsettle. They struck at the foundations of centuries of belief. Christianity, Traore declared, arrived in Africa like a gift. But what kind of gift is it if it arrives with chains? What kind of gift is it if it tells you to pray while your land is stolen? What kind of gift is it if it teaches you to forgive the thief but never to rise and defend what belongs to you? The air crackled. Gasps rose from the audience, and the cameras caught faces etched with shock and recognition. Some clapped loudly, unable to contain their agreement. Others shook their heads in disbelief, as though they had heard blasphemy uttered live on air. This was not polite critique. This was indictment. Rick Warren, a man whose voice had guided millions, shifted uneasily in his seat. His hands clasped, his brows furrowed, his lips parted as though searching for words that would neither betray the gospel nor dismiss the truth spoken before him. Finally, he responded with measured tone. "President Traore, I cannot deny what you are saying, that Christianity has been misused, sometimes cruelly. But let us be clear. True Christianity is not empire. True Christianity is not oppression. It is the good news of Christ who came to set all mankind free." The audience hushed, sensing the weight of Warren's defense. Yet before his words could settle, Traore leaned forward again, his eyes fixed not only on Warren, but on the millions watching beyond the cameras. "Pastor, culture does not distort the gospel. Hypocrisy does. Greed does. Empire does. Christ never demanded a people erase their culture to follow him. He asked only that they live in love, justice, and humility. If Christ could speak the language of his people, wear their clothes, and live their traditions, why should Africans not be able to follow Christ without first becoming European?" Thunderous applause erupted, shaking the studio walls. The young president's conviction was undeniable. Even Rick Warren, seasoned in the art of oratory, appeared shaken, his usual confidence tempered by the force of a truth voiced with fearless clarity. The dialogue surged forward like two rivers colliding. Warren grounded his responses in Scripture, reminding the audience of Christ's sacrifice for all humanity, of the cross that transcended culture and geography. Yet Traore expanded those very scriptures, drawing lines between biblical justice and the struggles of his continent. He spoke of widows abandoned by systems of greed, of children taught to despise their heritage, of nations that had been told to bow their heads and wait for heaven while their oppressors built heaven on earth. The tension was no longer confined to the studio. Across the globe, hashtags began trending within minutes. Clips of Traore's fiery words spread across social media. Some praised him as a prophet of a new age, a voice of truth for an anti-colonial Africa. Others condemned him as dangerous, a man twisting faith into rebellion. Yet nobody was indifferent. Inside the studio, the clash reached its peak. Rick Warren raised his hand, seeking calm. "Ibrahim," he said slowly, "you are asking the church to reckon with history, and rightly so. But I must ask you, how do we hold to the truth of Christ without allowing culture to distort it? How do we ensure the gospel remains pure?" For a moment, the room was still. Then Traore answered, each word deliberate, piercing through the air like arrows. Pastor, Christianity without truth is a cage. Christianity without love is hypocrisy. Christianity without courage is slavery. If you preach a Christ that tells people to accept injustice silently, then you are not preaching Jesus. You are preaching Caesar. The words fell like thunder. The audience erupted once more, some rising to their feet, clapping and shouting in agreement. Others sat frozen, their expressions torn between reverence and fear. Even Warren, his face solemn, could not hide the impact. His lips tightened, his eyes lowered for a brief second, as if acknowledging the blow of a truth too sharp to dismiss. The cameras captured it all: the defiance of a young African leader, the vulnerability of a global pastor, and the restless energy of a crowd sensing they were witnessing history. For the millions watching, the question was no longer whether this was a debate. It was whether they had just seen Christianity itself placed on trial. And as the program moved forward, the storm that had begun in that studio spread into living rooms, churches, and communities worldwide. People were no longer asking who won the debate. They were asking, what kind of Christianity will shape the future of Africa? The cliffhanger was undeniable, but the ripples of this confrontation were only beginning to shake the nations. When the broadcast ended, the studio lights dimmed, but the fire of that conversation burned across Burkina Faso and beyond. In the streets of Ouagadougou, people gathered in markets and cafes, speaking not of policy or war, but of faith, dignity, and the meaning of salvation. For years, religion had been treated as a private matter, locked within churches and mosques. Yet now, through Traore's words, it had become a weapon of liberation, a call to conscience, a summons for nations to rethink their future. For the ordinary citizen of Burkina Faso, this moment carried more weight than the speeches of diplomats. Mothers who had prayed for bread for their children heard in Traore's voice a reminder that God does not ignore the cries of the poor. Farmers tilling the land recognized in his words the dignity of labor long overshadowed by imported notions of progress. Youth, restless and eager for change, shared clips on their phones, declaring that faith was no longer about waiting for heaven. It was about demanding justice on earth. Politically, the shockwaves were immediate. Leaders within Burkina Faso, who had once viewed religion as a soft domain of pastors and priests, now realized it had become a battlefield of ideas. The president had reframed Christianity not as submission but as resistance. His confrontation with Rick Warren was not only theological, it was a declaration of independence, a message that Burkina Faso would not bow to narratives shaped in Western capitals. In the parliament, debates flared. Some politicians praised Traore, saying his courage gave the nation a moral compass. Others warned that challenging global religious leaders could isolate the country. But one thing was clear: the discussion had moved beyond politics as usual. It had become a national reckoning with the past, a confrontation with the colonial shadows that still haunted the land. Churches, too, were shaken. Pastors who had for years preached docility found their pews filled with restless congregants asking questions they had never dared to voice. Why were our traditions called evil? Why were our languages silenced in prayer? Why were we told to forgive endlessly while suffering endlessly? The confrontation had opened a wound but also created space for healing. In villages, elders spoke with renewed confidence. They remembered how colonial missionaries once demanded they abandon their ancestral songs and dances, labeling them heathen. Now they heard in their president's words a validation that their culture was not the enemy of Christ. If Jesus could wear Jewish garments, they repeated, why should we not wear ours before him? The political implications reached further still. Neighboring nations watched carefully. Some governments feared that if Burkina Faso's people embraced a gospel of liberation, their own citizens might rise with similar demands. Others quietly admired the boldness, sensing a shared struggle that transcended borders. The phrase, a Christianity of liberation, began to circulate across the continent, whispered in churches and discussed in universities. Economically, too, there was a ripple. International observers speculated whether such rhetoric could influence trade, diplomacy, and aid. For decades, Western partners had tied development funds to cultural expectations, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt. But if Burkina Faso rejected the premise that foreign definitions of faith and civilization were superior, what else might it reject? This was no longer only about religion. It was about sovereignty itself. And here lies the deeper truth. The confrontation between Traore and Warren did not simply divide opinions. It inspired a new vision of what governance and spirituality could mean together. For once, the lines between church and state blurred, not in oppression, but in collective empowerment. In the homes of believers, questions multiplied. What does it mean to be a Christian African? Must faith always be borrowed from foreign tongues, or can it speak in the rhythm of our drums? For some, these questions sparked fear. For others, they ignited hope. The hope that Christianity could be reborn as a faith that builds rather than erases, that empowers rather than enslaves. The reaction was not uniform, and it was not always gentle. Certain voices accused Traore of heresy, warning that his reinterpretation of faith could destabilize fragile communities. But to the youth in particular, his words were a trumpet blast. They saw in him not just a politician, but a prophet of a new age, a man declaring that Africa's chains, spiritual as well as political, must finally be broken. And here we must ask the question that lingers in the hearts of millions. Do you believe this is the voice Africa has been waiting for? Type your amen in the comments, because this is more than theology. This is about identity. This is about sovereignty. This is about whether Africans can define their faith and their politics without seeking approval from distant capitals. For the people of Burkina Faso, the confrontation was not an isolated moment on television. It was a mirror, reflecting their struggles and their resilience. It was a torch, lighting the path towards a future shaped by their own hands. And yet, as powerful as the reaction was within the country, the world outside was watching, preparing its own response. But the ripples reached far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The storm that began in a studio in Burkina Faso did not stay within its walls. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, international media had already seized the story. Headlines emerged across Europe, America, and Africa. Some called it a theological earthquake, others a dangerous populist challenge. Yet no one could ignore it. In the United States, the reactions were split. Evangelical circles wrestled with the confrontation. For some, Rick Warren's calm composure was proof of his strength as a pastor, patient, thoughtful, refusing to lash back at provocation. But for others, his silence in the face of Traore's fiery critique was seen as a concession, almost an admission that the young African leader had touched a truth too deep to deny. Christian radio shows debated for hours. Was Traore liberating the gospel or distorting it? American politicians, though cautious, also took note. A head of state challenging the legacy of Western Christianity in such bold terms could not be dismissed. Some feared his words might fuel broader resistance to Western influence, not only religious but political and economic. Others quietly admitted that his voice reflected a frustration long simmering across the global South, a frustration that the United States could not afford to ignore. Across Europe, commentators framed the confrontation through the lens of history. Newspapers in France, Britain, and Belgium, nations once at the heart of colonial expansion, recognized the sting of Traore's words. He had drawn a direct line from the missionary presence of past centuries to the political influence still felt today. Was this a rebuke of faith itself, or of empire hiding beneath faith's cloak? Analysts disagreed, but the debate refused to fade. In Africa, the reaction was more visceral. Leaders within the African Union and ECOWAS watched carefully, knowing the confrontation had stirred a collective memory of colonial wounds. Some states publicly supported Traore's boldness, praising him for daring to say what many leaders whispered in private. Others, wary of straining ties with Western allies, kept silent. Yet even in silence, the people spoke. From Nigeria to South Africa, congregations buzzed with the echo of his challenge. Is Christianity in Africa a tool of liberation or a remnant of empire? Russia and China, too, observed the moment with interest. Both nations, eager to expand influence on the continent, recognized the power of an anti-colonial message. Traore's words aligned with a narrative they had long promoted, that Africa must free itself from Western dominance. While their support was pragmatic rather than spiritual, it nevertheless added fuel to the fire of global debate. At the heart of it all stood the United States. Rick Warren was not merely a pastor, he was an American symbol of global Christianity. And so the confrontation was read not only as a theological debate, but as a challenge to American soft power itself. Could the gospel America had so proudly exported withstand the charge that it arrived bound to empire? Could Washington continue to present itself as a moral leader while voices like Traore's demanded a different story for Africa? The world was listening. The question was no longer simply about two men in a studio. It was about the future of faith, power, and identity on a continent rising from its past. Yet the question remained, who will shape the future of faith in Africa? When the echoes of Traore's words reached across the world, the question was no longer what had happened in that studio. The real question became, where does Africa go from here? Two roads stretched before the continent. The first was familiar, the well-trodden path of silence. To continue bowing under the weight of a Christianity taught through colonial eyes, to accept a faith that comforts but does not challenge, to pray for heaven while tolerating chains on earth. This path was safe, but it was also suffocating. It offered peace without dignity, hope without justice. The second road was less certain but filled with possibility. It was the road of reclamation, the choice to redefine Christianity not as an inheritance of empire, but as a living force for liberation. This road demanded courage because it required confronting old structures, questioning long-held assumptions, and risking the disapproval of powerful voices abroad. Yet it also offered freedom, the freedom to worship Christ as Africans without erasing language, culture, or identity. It offered the chance to link faith with sovereignty and sovereignty with progress, a bridge toward true African development. For the elders of the continent, this choice was deeply personal. They remembered the arrival of missionaries with both gratitude and pain, schools and hospitals built alongside demands to abandon traditions. For the youth, the choice was urgent. They saw a continent young in population yet rich in spirit, hungry for a faith that did not demand surrender but inspired creation. And in this choice lay not only the destiny of Africa, but also the message it would offer to the world. For if Africa could show that faith and culture need not be enemies, that gospel and heritage could stand hand in hand, it would do more than liberate itself. It would remind the entire Christian world of the Jesus who walked among fishermen, who embraced the poor, who overturned the tables of injustice. The road ahead will not be easy. Western powers may resist. Local elites may fear losing control. Even within churches, voices will rise to defend the old order. But the tide of history cannot be stopped. As Traore's confrontation revealed, the hunger for truth and dignity runs deeper than fear. And so the future of Africa rests on a decision. Will it remain defined by a borrowed Christianity of silence, or will it claim a gospel of liberation that echoes through its own languages and dances across its own drums? One thing is certain. The choice will not be made in silence. It will be made in the streets, in the churches, in the homes of millions who now ask themselves what faith really means. And so the final word had to be spoken, not by leaders alone, but by a continent rising to claim its soul. The cameras faded to black, but the words of Ibrahim Traoré did not fade. They lingered in the air in the minds of millions like a trumpet that refuses to be silenced. For the first time in a generation, a head of state had spoken not only as a politician, but as a preacher of dignity, daring to tell the world that Africa's faith must no longer be borrowed, chained, or silenced. This was not just a debate between two men. It was a mirror held up to history, exposing the wounds of a continent and the resilience that flows from those wounds. Rick Warren, though shaken, listened. And in his listening, he represented much of the Western Church, faced with a truth that could no longer be avoided. The truth that Christianity in Africa must no longer serve empire but liberation. For the elders who watched, it was the vindication of their memories. For the youth, it was a vision of a future where faith does not erase identity but strengthens it. For the world, it was a reminder that the gospel of Christ was never meant to be chained to power. It was meant to set people free. And so the question remains with us. Will Africa choose silence, or will it rise to claim its voice? The answer may well shape not only the destiny of Burkina Faso, but the destiny of the continent itself. An anti-colonial Africa is not just a dream, it is a demand. And in that demand lies the possibility of true African development, built not on borrowed faith, but on faith that empowers. If you have felt the fire of these words, let them not pass as another headline. Like, share, and subscribe, because our ancestors prayed for a day when Africa would speak with its own voice, and that day has come. Let the world hear, new Africa, strong Africa, free Africa. The journey is not over. It is only beginning. And perhaps, as Rick Warren himself whispered, this is the message we all needed to hear. Because when the sheep of God rise as lions, no empire can silence them. And an anti-colonial Africa will no longer bow.